seats up front. Well, hello again. I'm Josh Seeger. I'm going to introduce our keynote for the technical half of our audience. But if you're not, don't fear. I'm sure this will be interesting. Nathaniel Osgood is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science and associate faculty in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology and Division of Bioengineering at the University of Saskatchewan. His research is focused on providing cross-link simulation, ubiquitous sensing, and inference tools to inform understanding of population health trends and health policy trade-offs. His applications work has addressed challenges in the communicable, environmental, chronic, and zoonotic disease areas. In addition to health applications, Dr. Osgood is the co-creator of 2 novel wireless sensor-based epidemiological monitoring systems, most recently the Google Android-based IEPI smartphone system. He has additionally contributed novel, new innovations to improve dynamic modeling quality and efficiency, introduced novel techniques that hybridize agent-based novels with traditional system dynamics approaches, which combine simulation models with decision analysis tools, and which leverage such models using data gathered from wireless real-time epidemiological monitoring systems. Dr. Osgood is the instructor for the annual Agent-Based Modeling Bootcamp for Health Researchers, which is where we became aware of him, and recently served as a visiting associate professor at MIT. Prior to joining the U of S faculty, he graduated from MIT with a PhD in computer science in 1999, served as a senior lecturer at MIT, and worked for a number of years in a variety of academic, consulting, and industry positions. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Nathaniel Osgood.
Thanks so much for those kind words, Josh. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here today to share with you some thoughts on a really interesting confluence of trends and technologies and approaches that I think may have a bearing, perhaps a very significant bearing, on how survey research is conducted, particularly in the health area, going forwards. My presence here at the conference is a particularly privilege because while I do almost all my work in interdisciplinary teams, working closely with those who have significant training in survey design, the analysis of survey data, and while I work a great deal with survey data myself, this will be my first opportunity to work and interact with those who do a lot of work in the field and are involved in the day-to-day operations of survey delivery. In many ways, I believe the sort of knowledge that you folks can impart through questions and discussion will more than match whatever I can translate from my side. So again, great pleasure and privilege to be with you today to start this dialogue. So my talk is entitled Moving Beyond Myth and Madness, and the title is inspired by a quote from epidemiologist Phil Zuckerman, translated to me by colleague Mark Orr. The theory without data is myth, and data without theory is madness. And of course, many of those in the audience here are tasked, charged with the great responsibility of informing theory with substantial amounts of empirical data. And I'll talk with you today about why the sorts of technologies that we'll be getting a glimpse of today will make this ever more important. And while the role of interviewer, the role of respondent in answering interview questions will become ever more insightful and ever more important going forward. So in today's talk, I'm going to be giving a brief indication of some motivations for the sort of work that you'll see presented. I'm then going to talk as one vignette of this sort of new generation of epidemiological survey platforms. Take a look at this IEPI platform, which is a platform we've evolved at the University of Saskatchewan specifically for health research. And we'll look at several components of that platform, discuss some of its limitations and future directions. We're then going to talk about bringing together theory as captured in the form of computational models of several different sorts on the one hand, with data from smartphones and other aspects of big data that I'll be introducing. We'll talk about why cross-leveraging these two components, I believe, could confer particularly great value and may serve as a significant driver for a lot of additional data collection going forward in the health space. Talk about the potential implications for survey research, and then one slide with some take-home points from the talk. So I thought I'd begin the talk with two motivations. And the first was alluded to indirectly in some of the discussion within the previous keynote, where the speaker introduced some notions from the complex systems area. My work within this area focuses on addressing complex health challenges. It's focused on informing decision makers in health how to manage really vexing and tricky sets of issues that confront modern epidemiology, modern public health. These include blowback effects from earlier interventions gone awry, the development of antibiotic-resistant organisms, for example, in hospitals and nosocomial infection, the increasing presence of what we call syndemics, of mutually interacting conditions. This is a term coined by UConn professor Meryl Singer for describing situations where we see epidemic-like phenomena on several different conditions at the same time, often in the same communities that are all too often afflicted by significant health inequities and significant amounts of powerlessness. So Meryl Singer and others have documented, for example, syndemics of substance abuse, violence, and AIDS, ways in which these three conditions, oft studied in isolation, interact and mutually worsen each other, or between crime, poverty, suicide, and substance abuse. Not only do we have to grapple with epidemics, but with syndemics today. There's also an increasing recognition of the way in which human health is linked, perhaps intractably, to areas of ecosystem health and animal health. So the emerging interest in zoonoses, for example, emerging infectious diseases such as the SARS virus, perhaps HIV actually falls in this category, and some of the coronaviruses you'll see now from Saudi Arabia. It's a set of life course issues. We're realizing ever more keenly just how small the world is once you consider global travel, how quickly pathogens can spread. And there's the fact that lowered risk perception on many fronts leads to complacency and leads to increased risks. And finally, we have a very heavy burden, particularly in the US, of health disparities. Within the space of trying to grapple with these conditions, we also are in a situation of needing to outmaneuver ever more nimble and data-hungry corporate actors. The fact is that for the past decade and more, there's a large variety of corporate actors who do not have the public health as their primary focus. They may be tobacco companies, they may be companies interested in selling soft drinks, food products. And these corporate actors have been highly involved in securing data, often increasingly electronic data, concerning the behavior of individuals that they term consumers or potential consumers, and turning that into ways to affect their behavior. For example, tobacco companies these days are opening online sites to maintain their relationships with current smokers, to decrease the chance that smokers will be successful in quitting attempts, and perhaps try to lure them back in through relapse. Social media and online communities are being set up by tobacco companies as well. Couponing is being used to actively thwart public health interventions administered through the FDA, and personalized marketing efforts are now increasingly being used to very precisely target particular consumers for messaging associated with product placement. So corporate actors out there are seeking to influence the health behavior of individuals, and often in adverse conditions. A key challenge in countering all these effects is reliably securing data on key health behaviors that are often really challenging to measure. These include things like social context of individuals, the ways in which people's social environment end up influencing their behavior. For example, their propensity to relapse to smoking when they're surrounded by their colleagues who remain smokers. The ways in which the physical environment, the presence of sidewalks or the presence of walking paths or other amenities may shape physical activity. The ways in which fast food advertising, et cetera, affect people's eating habits. These things are hard to measure through traditional instruments, and absent an understanding of those influences, the potential to qualitatively evaluate certain types of policy trade-offs is greatly limited. We're increasingly building computational models, and we'll talk about some particular examples of those later, which can represent these sort of factors, but we don't have the requisite understanding of how people's behavior is shaped by a variety of these influences to inform those models and make them reliable. Fortunately, at the same time as all these things are going on, we're seeing a confluence of other trends which offer some real potential. The first is the growth in the penetration of smartphones in many segments of society. There's many segments of society that are still underserved by digital technologies, smartphones included, but smartphones are increasingly being used by people through all walks of life. How many people in this room themselves own a smartphone, something like a Google Android phone or Google Android phone or iPhone? A large fraction. Of those who do not, how have family members who own such a phone? Just a few hands, because almost everyone had them. What we see today is smartphones penetrating at remarkable levels into people's daily habits, and much of this penetration is driven by the tremendous functionality that these phones offer, such as the characteristics listed here. What's less widely realized is that a large fraction of the functionality of these phones is possible because of the presence of sensors. These sensors allow these sort of common functionality that recommend these phones to so many people for activities throughout daily life. The interesting thing is that these sensors on these phones can be repurposed at little or no cost to their original function to give health insight, to collect data that can inform our understanding of health behaviors. The second major trend here, which has been going on quite without planning on the part of health authorities, is the emergence of what I term a wireless cacophony around us. All through this room, all through our bodies, there's a wide variety of wireless signals that are propagating right now. Signals associated with protocols such as Wi-Fi, used for the connection of your phone or your personal computer to the web, for example, Bluetooth, GPS signals to allow you to locate yourself, increasingly signals for cell phone coverage available even in rural areas, and additional techniques such as RFID used for tagging devices, for example. These are routinely used for communication of information, but these signals can also be repurposed at little or no cost to their original function to provide other information, provide aspects of context. Where are we? Are we likely to be indoors or outdoors? If we're outdoors, where outdoors? If we're indoors, where are we within the building? What space are we in? How close are we to a nearby person? This sort of information can be of great value in interpreting aspects of health behaviors, and it's available more or less for free by artful use of these signals all around us. So I'd like to talk about one system that makes use of this information to provide health information. And this is a system which is increasingly in use by a variety of partners, particularly throughout Canada and the US, but we have very strong expressions of interest in Australia that will probably lead us to use there as well. And it's a system which we've been working on for about 3 years now. This is a second-generation sensing platform specifically designed for health area. It's based on Google Android for smartphones, although we do have versions of it for earlier versions of those smartphones. For those who are not familiar with it, Android is the #1 selling smartphone platform out there. And It's a platform that's widely used because of a huge variety of apps that are available, and because it allows for somewhat freer operation than the iPhone. What we provide is IEPI atop these smartphones as a standard app. Because it's a richly functional smartphone, there's an internal incentive for people to carry the devices. There's episodic data collection that is used to collect data within these devices. And we collect information on a wide variety of sensor modalities. And there's an opportunistic data backhaul that brings data over from the smartphone on the one hand on the left to our servers on the right whenever possible. In some studies, this occurs literally at diverse periods throughout the day, perhaps every 5 minutes. In other studies, it includes every few days as people happen to come into contact with certain wireless networks on which transmission is approved. In occasional cases, such as a recent study we've been running in housing projects in New York City, for cost reasons, it's taken place when we collect the phones. So we have a wide variety of functionality that's running on the phone to collect information, and then we have a variety of analysis tools on the right-hand side that help analyze that data. So we've addressed a variety of key health areas within this, and we collect information from a variety of sensor modalities to inform those areas. These include classic positioning tools such as GPS, Bluetooth to discover proximity between peoples, Wi-Fi to help us locate where we are within a facility, as well as to transmit data, accelerometry to help us understand physical activity level. For those not familiar with it, accelerometers, does anyone know why an accelerometer is on your iPhone or why it's on your Android phone? What is that used for? Yeah, it's when you turn the screen so it can reorient itself. This is the same sort of 3-axis accelerometer that's routinely used, for example, for the NHANES study, the National Health and Nutrition Examination survey that was done to have physical correlates to physical activity levels. These accelerometers are extremely powerful, and they're used for prosaic purposes on the phone. It's also used for certain games. You can shake the phone, and it will react in certain ways. The accelerometer is used to measure physical activity for our tools, and we have a significant and growing questionnaire module that's used as well. To give you some sense of this, we collect data typically every 5 or 10 minutes between individuals, and what this leads to is typically 1 to 2 million records per person per day, per respondent per day. For purposes here, I've aggregated up this data at an extreme level of contact between participants within a very small study that we did some years ago. And each of these lines, each of the dots represents a person, and a line between 2 dots indicates that those 2 people were in contact for a given hour's period of time. The fact that these linkages are flashing means that 2 people were going in and out of contact in different hours throughout the day. This is an illustration of the sort of fine-grained character of the data, except that even this is a grossly aggregated form of our contact data. We are literally recording people's social proximity to others every 5 minutes, whereas this is shown on an hourly basis. So we can map out, for example, people's contact patterns from week to week and plot evolution within those contact patterns on subsequent weeks. We can record information such as contact duration, which is devilishly hard for people to remember accurately, to reflect on, and to give an estimate of it, even right after the fact, is challenging. To do so hours later, report on people that you were in contact with even for brief periods is very challenging. Accelerometry can capture patterns of activity through the day, in particular types of physical activity that are distinguishing. They can also help us recognize if a phone is, for example, left on a table or is actually being carried with a person. We can capture aspects of geographic movement here, for example, throughout Canada. And we can look at movement day to day, for example, people's activity spaces, as they're called, going from work to home, etc., back and forth. This sort of data can help us recognize, for example, modes of transport. Recognize, for example, the fact this person on the left is going on a standard bus route from one area of the city to another, while this person here may be going, in this case, via car. Others we can recognize through walking. But Localization, identifying where someone is not limited to outside. We have fairly sophisticated indoor localization software, which can be used to estimate where you are within a facility, what floor of a facility you are in, what particular room you're in. And we do this through a variety of so-called localization techniques based on a technique known as Bayesian inferencing, which allows us to kind of put 2 and 2 together about the various strengths seen in various Wi-Fi nodes around us. The fact that we see 3 bars for this Wi-Fi node, 2 for that one, 1 for this one, 5 for this other one, suggests that we're in a very localized area. So we sort of put 2 and 2 together to figure out where we must be within a certain range in some probability distribution. We also have questionnaire capability that's been slowly built up with this device. So for example, the device can trigger questionnaires in a classic experience sampling type of fashion. In other words, it could trigger them with a certain chance on a per hourly basis or a certain fixed times during the day. However, we can also have them contextually triggered. For example, when you come into contact with more than a certain number of measured people, when your social density somehow changes, or when you've just gone outside in the morning, or perhaps when you've first awoken in the morning and it senses that activity. We can have these contextually triggered to go off and ask questions that are germane to that particular change. For example, when you're engaged in high levels of physical activity, what is the purpose of this activity? Is it to get from A to B? Is it for health reasons? Is it for recreational reasons? Is it because you've been told to do it as part of your job? We can use questionnaires in a very important way to disambiguate the sort of data that we pick up, to help shed light on the interpretation of this data. For example, if we measure through various sensors such as magnetometer, the GPS reporting speed, acceleration, we recognize someone's likely to be in a vehicle, we can ask the nature of the vehicle. Are they in a taxi or in a car, for example, and differentiate those. A bus we might also ask, but we might be able to figure out from bus schedules if they're likely to be in a bus based on the stops that it takes. Our system has been federated with a variety of other complementary systems that work with it. These include a weight scale, so we actually have paired this for certain studies with scales that measure people's weight, and so every time they go to weigh themselves, they use the phone to actually see the weight, and the phone automatically records the weight as well as reactions to the weight. So their affect and reaction to the weight, which is believed to be an important mediator for weight loss, cycling, etc. We have a photo food diary where people are asked to take photos of their food. This is led by my colleague Regan Mandrick, who's a fellow faculty member in my department. And there the individuals take photos of their food, and we have dietitians, for example, looking at this food to help judge its nutritional content. It's, of course, cross-linked with all this other data, so we not only know some image of what they're eating, but we know where they're eating, with whom they're eating, how often they're eating, which confers additional value. We have a geo-crowdsourcing app that can help us map out exposures to billboards, for example, exposures to messaging about tobacco through ads up in bars or in gas stations. And we have a very detailed indoor positioning location led by my colleague Scott Bell. And finally, we have done some work with communication monitoring, communicational behavior from the person on the phone to others, for example, what websites they're visiting, etc. There's a variety of extensions under development for this system. They include extensions that would help it engage in what's called adaptive sampling. In other words, changing how frequently it samples based on context, so that it samples more frequently when it seems likely that something interesting is going to happen, and it samples less frequently at certain times, such as evening, when a person's likely to be sleeping, where not much seems to be going on. That can help conserve battery. We also are planning to move it in a direction that picks up data from a variety of other devices, such as blood glucose meters, respiration and pulse sensors, and thermometers, etc., for certain ability to measure fever for certain infectious diseases. And there's a variety of other tools that we're working on, such as ways that we could measure, for example, if someone's in proximity with a TV. So this data, each of these modalities in and of itself, for example, who someone is near, or where they're located at a given time, how much physical activity they're engaging in, that's of interest. But I would argue that there's a form of Metcalfe's law that operates here. For those not familiar with it, Metcalfe's law is named after Bob Metcalfe, Robert Metcalfe, who's the inventor of Ethernet. That's the standard protocol used these days to link computers up in a wired fashion. So that big plug, it looks like a big phone plug you plug into the back of your computer sometimes. That was first created by Bob Metcalfe, the protocol which uses that. And he argued that the value of a network goes up not proportional to the number of nodes in the network, but with the square of the number of nodes, because each new node added, think about yourself joining Facebook, for example. If you joined Facebook as the first one in your family to be on there, or the first one among your friends to be on there, it would confer some value, but honestly, the value would be much, much greater if you joined after much of your family's already there. So each successive node added is conferred value by all those nodes that are already there. And so it is with this sort of data. It's really the cross-linking of this sort of multiple types of data that confer value. For example, the capacity to map activity level over geography and spot where the areas in the city are with the highest amounts of physical activity. To map where social interactions are occurring, for example, at different times of day from two different participants, participant 1, participant 2. We can map out spaces where contacts take place and how many people are noted as being seen within each of those spaces, both other survey participants and some people who are not in the survey but are carrying types of devices which make themselves publicly known about. There's other types of electronic data sources that add great value to the sort of sensor data we're talking about here and the type of survey data, questionnaire data that we can collect on these phones. One of them, for example, is weather reports. To understand someone's travel patterns as we note them day to day, to really interpret them well, particularly in a city such as ours, which exhibits significant climate variability, knowing something about the weather is useful. Is it -30 out right now? Might shed light on why people are traveling the certain paths they are, why they go the long route around where they can stay inside all the buildings rather than walking directly. We could use GIS databases. For example, GIS databases to map out the types of services to which a person is exposed in the course of their actual empirical activity spaces, the actual paths that they take day in, day out. What types of services are they near? Are they near, for example, only convenience stores, or do they actually pass close to a grocery store? This can be very important for understanding phenomena such as food deserts. We can cross-link this data with environmental sensing systems, information on public transit routes and schedules, as well as to a variety of types of traditional data, administrative data, vaccination records, and one thing that we use in almost all studies is cross-linking this data to basic questionnaires issued upfront for baseline characteristics. So a person's demographics, for example, some aspects of their attitudes, etc. So using a system like this, we can start to articulate and work towards answering a variety of questions germane to the sort of health quandaries we noted at the beginning of the talk. For example, asking how do physical activity levels vary by proximity to parks, or by social context, or by neighborhood safety? How is food intake, for example, associated with physical activity? It turns out that food and physical activity are associated with a complex series of feedback loops. And while researchers have done an admirable job mapping out the physiology of food digestion, the energy balance within the body, this interaction psychologically and as driven by other aspects of cognition on food intake and the way which it relates to physical activity much of it remains to be elucidated. How often do participants visit restaurants? Which restaurants are they visiting? Which grocery stores, etc.? So as many of you may have been wondering, is this a tool for Big Brother? You know, is this the sort of system which is at a technological level possible, but which is really dangerous? Well, early on, before we built any such system, we took counsel with our Behavioral Ethics Review Board and discussed the implications of a system like this. And we ended up paring back some of the technological possibilities so that we could more meaningfully guarantee anonymity, more meaningfully guarantee privacy despite the richness of data that is collected. We provide a variety of tools for helping to raise confidence in the privacy of the device and to help ensure that even if the device is captured or if data were to be eavesdropped upon, there be no way that someone outside the study designers, the researchers involved, could make sense of it. So one issue is we provide a snooze option for data recording that allows the respondent at any point to disable data collection. We do this because it is seen as a necessity to help guarantee effective levels of compliance for people to have comfort with and trust in this device. And the ability to have some periods where their privacy is guaranteed is seen as very, very important to helping enhancing that trust. We have extremely strong on-device encryption. Literally, if I, as the creator of this system, as the person who guided this work, together with a colleague, Kevin Stanley, if I were to capture a device of this sort, I could spend months and not be able to break the keys used for this device. It's that strong. There's secure transmission, so even with eavesdropping, no sense could be made of the data. We do censor certain types of information, particularly on the Bluetooth technology side that could be potentially directly identifying. And we do provide additional study-by-study ways of disabling other data. And finally, we go through a very rigorous and often tiered informed consent process. By tiered, I mean that the participants in our studies can often indicate different levels of use of their data that they will permit. Some may only wish to permit it for aggregate displays. Others are comfortable, for example, with having individual anonymized data shown at an individual level, as long as there's no identifying information shown. A key constraint for all of this is energy. So the primary data collection constraint at a technological level is the limited capacity of the smartphone batteries. The more we measure from the device, the stronger the footprint there is on the energy side. And so we have to be very, very careful about what we measure and how often we measure it so that we don't drain the batteries too quickly. The good news here is that, how many people in here would have heard of Moore's Law? Has anyone heard of that? Okay, just a couple people. But roughly what it says is that the number of transistors that can be packed onto a computer chip roughly doubles every 18 months. And the reason that's important is because it led to faster and faster computers over many decades. Now, that's running into some turbulence in recent years. However, what is still going strong is what's called Kuhme's law, which indicates that power efficiency rises exponentially over time. So if you go out, say, every 2 or 3 years, the power efficiency of the phones you're using will approximately double. And what that means is we can do more with the same amount of power. So why are so many partners around the US and around Canada so interested in IEPI? What is it that draws it? Well, there's a couple features that motivate this interest. One is its longitudinal data over long periods of time with many, many samples. And it provides sufficient temporal resolution with sampling about every 5 minutes to 10 minutes to eliminate much recall bias, not all by any means, but to help lower the chance someone will simply forget, for example, what they ate for their most recent meal, or forget where they were a short time ago, or why they were there. It helps provide an ability to triangulate from multiple measurands. The fact that we can measure so many different things at the same time helps more clearly identify what is going on and helps lend meaning to some of the data that we do collect. It's automatically collected. For most of the data collected, there's no need to trouble the respondent. Occasionally, we will pop up a survey, and we try to keep those to 2 or 3 times a day to 1 or 2 questions each. We use a streaming-based reporting mechanism that provides that data back, often within hours from when it was collected. And it is also a system that's readily reconfigurable. So we can easily reconfigure it, for example, to collect certain information more frequently, to deploy an additional survey, to push out additional content where desired. And finally, it can be very readily cross-linked with stated responses on surveys that are collected via the phone or elsewhere. The data collected here, though, has some very serious limitations in it. This is not a panacea. This is one addition to a toolbox of techniques in the survey side, not a replacement for sure. So one issue is that data collection almost inevitably has some components of an intervention here. If we are providing the app for download to people's phones, then they will be aware of the fact that they're being monitored, and it may change their behavior in accordance with the Hawthorne effect or other known effects. If we are providing phones to, for example, lower SES populations for them to carry around with them, that phone inevitably ends up changing their life, at least in a little degree. And we are faced with the fact that this sort of data collection does involve some disturbance of the patterns of people's lives. We're not able to observe their natural behavior without any disturbance whatsoever. The accompanying consumer technologies that are on this phone sometimes pose problems. For example, when you're thinking about deployment of phones to children, one has to be very, very careful about giving them a smartphone because it may come with a variety of technologies which are not appropriate for a child of that age. In low SES populations, people from very limited means, offering a free phone for several months may be too big a deal for someone to refuse. And there may be a sense of coercion in an ethical sense that may mean that they feel impelled to participate in the study in a way that's not intended by the researchers, and that's not permissible. Ensuring de facto confidentiality is often challenging. We do our best to de-identify this data. In some cases, we've gone to lengths of trying to, for example, with geographic data, rotate the data and try to hide aspects of the city which might clue someone in as to where this is within the city that these people are circulating or what have you. The fact is, when we're dealing with data this rich, there's an extremely powerful capability to triangulate from multiple types of data to try to infer who a respondent might be. And we're grappling with that in study after study in deploying these systems. Often the data that's collected is quite low level. There's a lot of inference that has to go on to high-level classifications. And this requires a set of models that I'll be talking about in just a minute. It's not always straightforward to recognize directly from the data. And finally, at the current stage of these systems, and this covers our own system as well as other competitive systems, such as those from Cambridge University, from MIT, and from some collaborators in Turin, as well as from Penn State University. There's typically smaller sample sizes involved, and there's often been a fair bit of cost associated with connection to the cell phone network to collect the data back. We've been able to avoid that in some cases, but it's a persistent issue for many surveys that are conducted. So a central element for all of this is the consideration of human factor side. Exactly what you heard in the keynote earlier, the importance of trust. The importance of trust here, not just between respondent and interviewer, but respondent and the smartphone and those who have created the system for the smartphone. Willingness to share information on the smartphone. And frankly, there's a variety of other issues as well. The ease of carrying the smartphone. How easy is it, for example, to bring with you throughout your day of work as a nurse? These are the sort of challenges which confront us. And all of these affect compliance and they affect data quality. Because of these factors, in part, we have considered some other strategies which cross the line into interventions. One thing that we've done is to provide data feedback to the people whose data is collected. In this case, the participants in the study receive back information collected about themselves from the phone to provide, as it were, a more perfect mirror to reflect on their behavior. For example, the photo food diary that I spoke about is designed to provide people back with pictures of the food that they've eaten in recent days. In other cases, we may provide information back on their insulin dosing that they've provided or the blood glucose levels that they've measured. These are two components being factored into a study we're launching this fall for diabetics. So here we provide information to individuals to access their own data, and we also may provide data on an aggregate level from peers. And the idea here is that by giving them some stake in the quality of the data collected, they may feel additionally impelled to put in that extra level of effort in carrying the phone and keeping it charged, etc. One of my colleagues works in the area of persuasive technologies, Regan Mandrick. And the idea here is using devices such as this as tools for nudging people in towards healthier behavior. So, for example, reminders may be issued to check your blood glucose after a meal. There may be ways of assisting people's reflection on food, or notification of a person that a walking group is going to quickly form nearby you to help nudge you towards thinking about engaging in some physical activity. The sort of system we're talking about here, inasmuch as it collects a huge amount of contextual data, can be very helpful in formulating sensible nudges of this sort, but again, we're in the realm of intervention. There is, however, a component of this that I think may bear directly on the sort of work that you folks do, which I'm quite excited about. And I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the system in this direction. Currently, we do most of our work with providing redeployable sets of smartphones. We take smartphones and we provide them to participant populations. Those smartphones are then used. Sometimes they can be kept by the participant populations or sometimes returned at the end. And in the meantime, they've been able to use that phone fully as their own. It's connected to the network in most cases, etc. This is a valuable technique, and it can economize on the cost side, but we see a great future in use of this app more widely on participant-owned phones. The idea here is that there may be a persistent pool of individuals who are open to recruitment for many types of studies, and IEPI as an application stays persistently installed on these phones, and it provides a sort of study gateway, a tool for individuals to enroll in these studies. You might have a video-based informed consent or an interview-based informed consent process conducted with something like Skype, and it may provide a conduit for payment to these individuals. So the idea here is that the phone would be not just a tool for one study, but would be a gateway to many, many studies into which you could enroll if you are pre-qualified to do it and if you go through an informed consent process. This offers great potential, not least to the fact that it may be possible to have a retainer-type basis where your data retroactively could be obtained with your permission for a certain fee if it is needed, say, by public health authorities. So, for example, if there's an outbreak of foodborne illness, the public health authorities could request data on the part of individuals who have indicated their willingness to provide it, who have also been sickened, so that they could realize where there are common points that they had traveled that might be the source of the foodborne illness. or if there's an outbreak that's occurred, might recognize the contact patterns which gave rise to the outbreak retrospectively so that they can take action to lower the risk of similar outbreaks in the future. Where do questionnaires fit in all of this? Where questionnaire-based survey data offers tremendous value in the context of the sensor data. And I would argue that it offers, because it's able to offload a lot of routine questions that can be answered by the sensors, it allows us to use the questionnaires and use interviewing in a way that leverages the unique value that a human interviewer or that a questionnaire can retain. So, for example, we can measure quantities that cannot be directly ascertained with sensors, beliefs or cognitions. We can cross-check information with sensor data. It allows individuals to reveal their intentions. Again, why are you engaged in this physical activity? And it can allow people to express stated preferences in a way that might allow us to understand how they're likely to respond to different types of health interventions. And we have a variety of developments planned to leverage questionnaires more intensely. One of them I've already talked about. We have a quite sophisticated system right now of triggering questionnaires based on context. So we can trigger, for example, a questionnaire when a person has entered a certain facility or when they're present with it with a certain number of other people, etc. However, we also are interested in collecting a variety of paradata and metadata related to survey questions. For example, how much time did it take someone to open a questionnaire that was issued to them? How much time did each particular question take to be answered by that respondent? How much time were their eyes actually dwelling on the screen of the device, for example, while that question was answered, so that we could ascertain, were they really thinking about that question while pausing before answering it, or were they simply distracted? These are things which we can readily do on these smartphones because they typically have the requisite sensors to do these sort of calculations. So, for example, there's the most smartphones these days have a camera that's facing the user when they look down on its screen, and we can track their eyes fairly readily using techniques that have been pioneered in labs within our department. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of models here, and we'll then go on to speak about some of the unique implications of this for survey design. So models help, in this context, make sense of the data. It turns out the sort of data that we're collecting would be full of sound and fury and signify nothing if we didn't have models to make sense of it. The data is extremely voluminous. It is very, very detailed, both in terms of time and space. And without a variety of types of models, and I've listed several types here, it's hard to make sense of the patterns that we see in this data. So I'd like to give you a brief glimpse of a couple different types of models: machine learning models, inference models, and dynamic models that we are increasingly using to make sense of the data. I recognize that for the folks in the room, you're probably not involved on the modeling side, but I do believe that at least in the health area, the growing use of these sort of models going forward is going to drive a lot of health survey research of the sort we're talking about with these smartphones. So one type of model is an inferential model. So the idea here is, for example, we may collect data on contact patterns as observed throughout a nursing home, which has trouble with nosocomial infections, say with MRSA, a type of antibiotic-resistant nasty organism that spreads within hospitals and nursing homes and can cause fatalities. So within a nursing home, we may be able to record, for example, with these smartphones, people's contact with each other through proximity between those people and contact with surfaces based on where they are within the facility on a sub-meter level. Based on that sort of data, we can make use of a variety of inferencing techniques. We make use of what's known as Bayesian inferencing to help deduce who in this facility is at risk of being asymptomatically infected. They're being a carrier to the bug, but not showing symptoms of it. If we combine the sort of contact data with data on who's developed the illness, we may be able to track back, for example, the fact that for the 3 latest people who've developed this illness, they've all come into contact with this certain piece of equipment just days before they're developing the symptoms. Or we may be able to recognize, for example, that this particular staff member was held in common between 4 out of the 5 most recent cases of diagnoses. And that may allow us to zero in on that staff member or that piece of equipment for testing. It's not a definitive diagnosis, but it helps us avoid testing that simply, as described to me by colleagues in nursing home now, shots in the dark. Testing where you swab and really you have almost no chance of getting back a positive test. So we're making use of inference models to try to help point us to where good testing locations would be. Another type of model that we're using is what's called a hidden Markov model. And these sort of models help us understand what situations lie behind the data that we're observing by looking at multiple types of sensors. So for example, imagine if you were trying to figure out, is this phone being actually carried by someone or not? Of great importance, because if it's not being carried by someone right now, if it's just laying on their desk, for example, or laying in their backpack, it's not telling you much about them. It's not telling you about who's around them. It's not telling you about where they are. It's telling you what where the phone is or who's near the phone. So with hidden Markov models, what we can do is we can represent a situation where we have 2 states the phone could be in. It could be on the person, carried on the person, carried in their pocketbook, or carried in their pocket, or carried in their hand, or it could be off person. And we will get hints about that through a variety of different sensors. For example, the accelerometry readings on it. How much is it jerking around? If it's in your backpack, if it's on your pocketbook, on your person, we'd expect a certain amount of movement just because you're moving around. Similarly, is the phone, what's its status? We actually use the whole phone pose here, but if it's flat on a surface, if it's horizontal, there's a lot more chance, for example, that it's off person than that it's on the person, than it's actually with the person. We could also use some things like, is the phone plugged in right now? If so, it's much more likely, for example, to be on person, or off person than it is to be on person. So triangulating from a variety of these techniques, using this Markov model and recognizing that people do change their state with respect to the phone. They pick it up, they put it down, but not in the matter of seconds, from second to second to second on a very regular basis. We can map out over time periods of different sensors, and we can reason about, for example, the condition the phone is likely to be in at any one time based on their surrounding context and based on the sensors at a given time. For example, in this case, we might have medium levels of acceleration, which might lead you to think the phone is being carried directly on someone. It's not horizontal, again, lends confidence to that, and it's not plugged in. So that might lead us to think it's on the person, but if we know just before it, we saw almost no acceleration, just after it, almost no acceleration, and we saw that it was plugged in almost immediately after it, it lends suspicion that there's a pretty good chance it's actually not on the person at this moment. It may be off the person. So this is a hidden Markov model. Final type of model that we use, and I'll move through this quickly because I've got to finish up here, is something called a simulation model or dynamic model. And these models help us reason through behavior over time between a variety of factors. We are increasingly in the health area building these mechanistic models that help us understand, for example, people's patterns of physical activity and food consumption and how their weight changes in response to those over time. Or they help us understand, for example, ways in which infection will spread through a nursing home. It's a mechanistic model. It reflects over time sort of what's going on and helps us describe how we think things work within the world to explain these patterns that we see in the statistical data. These sort of models are increasingly being used to try to make better decisions, to try to serve as what-if tools for identifying, for example, more effective vaccination policies, or more effective policies for encouraging physical activity or encouraging healthier eating. So these dynamic models are growing in their popularity, and they work hand in glove with the sort of data that we've talked about. So for example, we're working with type 2 diabetes models, where the models here represent factors within a person's body at a physiological level. For example, their blood glucose level, their physical activity, their level of insulin within their body, for example, the level of glycogen, which is a way of storing carbohydrate-related energy. And we have a model that models how those things change over time in response to, for example, taking insulin, or in response to eating a meal, in response to exercising. And we can take a model like this and we can reground it in sensor data over time to give us an estimate going forward, for example, of how the blood glucose is likely to change over the next few minutes, or how a given amount of insulin taken now is likely to affect things. So we could use these models to project forward. Another example would be H1N1 transmission, say in a nursing home, where we've driven models which involve a person's state in terms of various levels of infection using contact patterns as observed from the phones. Or finally, models related to obesity, which track people's weight and body composition over time in response to their physical environment and the environment of people near them. The sobering thing that we've found, however, when we've worked with these models that describe pretty carefully how we think things operate in the world, and we drive them with this sensor data, what we found is that if we don't have enough sensor data, if we're not sampling frequently enough, our conclusions may change. For some questions, we don't have to sample that frequently, but for others, we need to sample literally at levels of every 5 to 15 minutes. And if we don't, we risk fooling ourselves. In other words, we'll come to very different conclusions using these models about what we expect to happen if we have data that's collected very frequently, every 5 to 15 minutes, versus, say, every hour or every 3 hours. So here, I would argue that we may be having a situation where this sort of sensor data, far from being a luxury, far from just being a novelty, it may actually be a requirement for really reliable decision-making in certain areas. Okay, I want to talk just one moment about the role of cloud computing, and then I'll have a section to finish up here. So within the cloud computing area, there's increasing amounts of computation and data storage which is occurring in a diffuse set of services that are collectively known as the cloud. The cloud, use of the cloud allows us to avoid relying on one particular set of computational location when performing calculations or when storing data, and allows a huge amount of fault tolerance. If one set of machines goes down, we can use a different set. It also brings to bear the computational strength of a huge number of different machines to solve problems. And we're increasingly looking to the cloud to store data and to perform the sort of calculations that we need to perform analyses using this sort of data. And increasingly, what that means is we may be able to take some of these types of analyses that are currently being done off the phone and do them on the phone, which may allow, for example, our use of models to anticipate when to collect information to be ever richer. So we can collect information ever more sensibly in a sort of punctuated way based on anticipation of what may be playing out over the next few minutes or the next few hours. So I'd like to talk about the implications of this in summary for health surveys. I believe that the set of technologies that are discussed here, together with the reliable and admirable set of technologies that are already present in the survey toolbox, can combine together to provide surveys that are more timely, more reliable, more insightful, more economical, and more important than ever. Why more timely? Well, we have the potential to stream data off of these devices literally on a matter of minutes between uploads. We can bring up contingently triggered questionnaires that bring in data sooner so that people's recollections are fresh, and so that we are asking questions at the critical times where the data collected is likely to be most reliable. We can identify barriers to effective survey delivery more quickly. We can identify, for example, situations where people are not responding to the questionnaires, where people are not even carrying the phones with them, or where they're simply allowing them to run out of charge. We can provide for faster processing of results and potentially quicker recruitment using that recruiting strategy I talked about earlier, where we have an app already on many respondents' cell phones which they can use to opt into a study. I believe the data collected here can be more reliable because we're capturing, in many cases, physical measures that past studies, for example, with the NHANES study, have suggested are more reliable than self-report. So for certain types of measures, for example, for physical activity or for eating habits, it's known that there's significant distortions involved. In some cases, it's through recall bias. In other cases, it may be for reasons of wanting to protect self-perception from interviewer. We have reason to believe that people's responses are questionable. And by measuring things using physical measures, Bluetooth-enabled weight scales rather than self-reported weight, for example, photos of what's eaten, for example, measures of physical activity based on accelerometry, we may be able to measure things more accurately. These multiple measures we use give a cross-check. They help us triangulate what's going on. And the fact that we have short time between samples and triggered questionnaires often allows greater insight as to what's the interpretation of the data and reliability of the data that's gathered. We have the potential to observe similar situations often many times because the data is so detailed and so voluminous. And we can recognize times when, for example, the phone is simply not carried by a person and try to interact with that respondent in a way that will encourage carrying the phone. I believe the data collected here can be more insightful in the sense that we do have not only a stereo view, as it were, a triangulated view of most events, but we also have diverse models to help make sense of the data and to help link that data to decision making. So increasingly, these data, such as the inference scheme, can be used to inform decision making about where to test in a nursing home. This data that's collected and used in conjunction with the diabetes models can be used to help improve better management of diabetes. Furthermore, the burden of questionnaires can be used to left for subjects that play to their strengths. So in other words, we can use these for purposes, for topics where they're required, where the data is not elicited properly by the sensors. There's a prospect for these sort of techniques improving the economies associated with survey design because it does allow unattended data collection for much of the data. The human attention can focus on certain key components of these key questionnaires, and there's many things which can be collected directly. And in many cases, there's the capacity to use these same phones to reach people in place. For example, to message the people, to remind them to carry the phones with them, or to encourage enhanced compliance in other ways. And finally, there may be opportunities for reducing recruiting costs by having this battery of persistent phones which will allow people to opt into studies. And finally, I'd like to say that I think the techniques here help enhance the importance of the interviewer-interviewee relationship by helping to elevate the use of the data to inform policy design by use of these models more directly, to help enhance the adaptiveness of surveys to collect data which are more timely and in a way that's more nimble, and where we uniquely use the interviewing techniques for the types of questions where they're most important. And finally, I should note that I think there's a very important role here for the sorts of data that we're talking about for outmaneuvering these corporate actors we talked about early on. So just some conclusions here. Sensors are uniquely, increasingly ubiquitous, and commodity sensor-bearing devices, such as I've been talking about, such as these smartphones, can serve a dual purpose as versatile sensor platforms beyond their normal functionality. Diverse communication signals, such as that surround us during most parts of our day, permit creative repurposing to lend understanding of context, and couples with models of various sorts. These hidden Markov models, these inferencing models, these models concerning policy choice and intervention outcomes, sensor data can offer significant and complementary health insights. Sensor data do offer a huge potential to sharpen, not to replace, traditional interview-based methods. And the sort of big data, the sort of sensor data linked with other aspects of electronically stored data, can enhance insightfulness, timeliness, reliability, and cost of survey while reducing burden to both participant and probably to interviewer as well. And finally, just one note, I believe that the sort of types of data collection we're talking about here will increasingly be the province not just of large-scale survey research, but also increasingly used by smaller players throughout academia and throughout public health and public interest research firms. It does not require a big budget, and it offers tremendous insights. So thank you very much. I'd like to offer my sincere acknowledgement for those who have helped make this work possible. And I'll just note two events that may be of possible interest to the participants here. The first of which focuses on this exact area which I was talking about today. So I'd like to open it up to questions.
So before we start, I have assurance from Nate that he will be here throughout the day. I was anticipating that there might be lots and lots of questions, and I'm sure they'll occur to you. Some of you will be lucky enough to sit with him at lunch. But we do have about 7 minutes for questions right now. If not, I do.
I'm curious to know what the geo data on his phones and stuff like that. You feel it's almost lost it.
Yeah.
You're be able to track that.
Yes, that's right.
So
And
the question was, for those who didn't hear it, since we're collecting geographic information on the phone, location information, would you be able to detect if someone actually lost it?
the answer is yes. We actually have used that capability in the past to good effects, and unfortunately the phone made its way to Iran, and so it's not currently within our reach for retrieval. But it's good to know. It's good to know where it's not, at least, right? So we can replace it adequately. But you're absolutely right that there are some features of the system which could confer value even to the participants in the study. And in principle, that sort of service could help participants, for example, in their day-to-day, the vagaries of their day-to-day life, and we're hoping that by enhancing those benefits further, it may help aid compliance. Great question. Others? Thought I saw another hand. Yes.
How long does the respondent have to carry this phone around?
Right. So the question was, how long does a respondent need to carry these phones? We've run surveys that range from about a week's time. So, for example, a recent survey among there was really a pilot study among a housing population that underwent housing relocation in New York City as part of a randomized controlled trial, up to about 4 months or so. One of the things that our data in modeling have suggested very strongly, however, is that at least a week's time is needed to yield meaningful data in certain areas. So we have done studies of how our conclusions would be affected by very, very short-scale survey deployments. For example, there's another group who've done admirable work, but deployed their systems for only a day in a high school. And our analysis suggests that the that just like there's no typical person that you'd want to distribute a phone to, there's no typical day. And so you'd want at least a week, and I would argue that in many cases, often more than that, to yield sort of reliable understanding of some of the patterns that you're likely to elicit. But it will depend on exactly how you're using the phones, what data you're collecting. Other questions? Yes? Yeah. So how often are, the question was, we do offer this snooze button, which is prominently displayed, and which the participants are trained on how to use, how to get to this screen and disable it at any point. They understand the implications. We have observed it being used significantly by certain participants. We also note that its use drops off very significantly within the first week or so of a study. And this is a comment which is shared by many colleagues of mine who also do technology work that has potential privacy implications, that often the privacy concerns are foremost in the first few days, but then they retreat to the back seat, after a week or so. So we have seen that used. It's clear that people know how to use it, remember that it's there, at least very early on, but the use of it tends to be less over time. Question? Yeah, so we've used a variety of incentives. So the question had, what sort of incentives do we use for these phones? We've gone through a variety of types. We've done, for our surveys with these sort of electronic-based systems, we've done everything from raffles with some very small courtesy for enrolling of I think, $50 or something like that, to situations where we've promised use of the phones permanently. So just provide them as a, essentially the person has it as their own phone. We for the most part used monetary incentives though, and I think we have a lot to learn on what might be most effective there. We have in some cases set incentives based on how much data on what fraction of the time the phone is charged. We reward them more. It's not, so they can disable the data collection, that's fine, but if they keep it charged more regularly, they get a higher reward just to make sure they don't accidentally let it run out of power. So that's something we've tied it to with a raffle, yeah. Yeah. Right. So right. Wonderful question. So the question had to do with my remark to the effect that it's hard to fully anonymize this data frequently, and the question was that a lot of organizations seek to release data publicly for the greater public good. And is it possible that the sort of data we're collecting could be anonymized in a sufficient fashion that it could support release publicly? This is something we're currently grappling with. Certainly subsets of it could be. There's no question that subsets could be. Once it comes to geo-coded information, things become particularly dicey, and we are working on strategies that would help enable that. But large components could. And I should note that MIT has released the reality mining data sets, which contain significant subsets, no survey data, in subsets of the sort of sensors we measure, but they are publicly available. So they've crossed that barrier. It's one our ethics board is not yet comfortable with, so we're in discussions with them, and we view that as very important.
So we're officially out of time.